Hi everyone, I'm here today to continue our conversation about working with the alternate clay materials of salt dough and cornstarch clay. Um, Before we talk about aspects of that building with those materials, I wanted to just address some of the ideas of armature. So when we're building a water-based clay project, often we're thinking of being able to describe the volume or the sculptural shape as a hollow form that's built up from a base to create a wall that describes the interior hollow space. And with these materials, you may elect to work because they're not fired and we do not need to solve the problems that we have to solve when we're firing water-based clay. You can work with armatures or internal structural systems that will support what you're doing that will not have any negative ramifications, vis-a-vis having to be fireable. So one thing that I did today in the spirit of the Figurine project is I started my own figurine, and I conceived of the base as something very much inspired by a 17th century, let's say Meissen porcelain figurine. I created a structure or a base that would hold the scene of my figures. It becomes, it provides a formal way for the figures to be supported and stable. It also provides a context, a visual context for them, and gives an indication of the universe or the world that these figurines would live in. So as a maker, I'm very interested in that, as just like I'm interested in the figures as carrying my stories or my concepts. I'm interested in the base as a carrier of that information as well. So what I did was I made this base with, I started with looking around in my recycling bin. Even though these aren't really recyclable, I've been saving them. They're foam trays that vegetables are often come to us on at the supermarket. And so I tape together foam trays with just blue painter's tape to create a kind of boxy open structure. And then I used paper mache. Again, paper mache is just wheat paste, which is flour and water, with, in my case, just newspaper strips that I tore, encaustically coated with the wheat paste. And then I built up around the foam structure to create what would be another structure when the wheat paste dries. It dries into a kind of hard surface. And so it visually brought together all the disparate panels of the foam structure, but it also provided another physical structure when it was dry. Then I made salt dough, and salt dough is just flour, salt, a lot of salt, and water. That's what you see here. And salt dough dries on its own to be a kind of hardened, more archival material. You can also heat it. So I was working, because I had, one idea, the salt dough is very, very, very almost, it doesn't have a lot of structure when it's wet and malleable. And so I really envisioned it becoming kind of a skin that needed the armature of this paper mache covered foam box to support it and give it the structure I wanted as a form. But it does dry on its own. It takes a long time, especially in my case where it was laminated to something where air couldn't reach the back. So I have a heat gun, which allows me to put intense heat in a more spot way, and I kind of just forced it dry, and then the heat will also harden it. You can use, if you don't have something like foam, you could put your salt dough creations in the oven at a 250-degree temperature and really make it more archival and hard. And once that is heated and becomes stronger and harder, you can immediately take wet material and add to it. So you can kind of work with the heating to provide structure and then keep building up to have the control over the shape that you want to make. So I made my base and I kind of dried it, and then I moved to the second material, which is cornstarch clay. Cornstarch clay I love because immediately Here's some wet cornstarch clay. It has qualities that we love about working with water-based clay. It has kind of a plasticity and an inherent structure when it's wet that allows me to do more building that I would be doing if I were in the ceramic studio. So I literally formed these two figures here as hollow forms, very similar to how I would approach a porcelain figurine in the studio. I literally rolled out angled tubes on a dowel. So I just make my solid linear form, thread it through this wooden chopstick, and then I can roll it and open a form, a hollow form. And now this form can be manipulated as a hollow form into a part of my figure, like the leg or the arm. And so I use those kind of methods to get to a hollow figure. I noticed that in my ambition for the figure, I mean, I could allow this material to stiffen like I would clay parts and then put them together at leather hard when there was more structure and support to do so. In my case, I chose to take something like this steel wool. Steel wool can be bought in bulk, more in bulk from your home supplier like Home Depot and Lowe's, those types of places, or the hardware store even. And it comes in a way that you have more, it comes in different finenesses. This is a more fine one. And this is a really interesting material because it's soft and malleable, but it's steel, so it has that kind of structure. So in my case, I stuffed my figure with this steel wool. And then one surprising thing that happened is when the salt in the cornstarch clay interacted with the steel wool and it dried over time, it leached from the steel a kind of rust into the interior surface where it was touching. So I'm really interested in that, and I would be in another piece exploring that as an active part of what the piece is. Another thing that you might do with something like steel wool is think of it more, not like I might think of it as more being blended into this material if I can. So I'm going to take a little bit of steel wool and literally taking the salt dough, and I'm kind of weaving the steel wool in, sort of kneading it in. I sort of made a little slab and I put the steel wool behind, and it provides a kind of structure that way. And then it inspires me to think about wrapping that around it. So the steel wool is starting to act almost like a third hand that supports my now hollow form from the inside. You can see the thinness and the wetness. It's sort of starting to deteriorate, revealing the steel wool form underneath. I really think I see potential here, because now the steel wool provides a kind of internal support that gives it some structure even though it's super, super wet. So you could work with these little sort of negotiations between materials and get to some very interesting possibilities for sculpture. Another thing is, here's just an example of the paper mache wrapped around a shape that started as aluminum foil from the kitchen, some old used aluminum foil. I just made the shape and then I wrapped my strips, and now it's quite stiff and hard from the wheat paste. This could also be the carrier of another layer of this soft modeling salt dough. And you can see I'm building up kind of like a fleshy skin around it, which would be a nicer surface later, of course, to draw and paint on. It would receive color, and I could control the texture. So that's another way of working, is sort of building out from your inner structure and then get to the modeling last when you have a lot of the form already in place from other materials. So another thing about this is, now that these sort of cornstarch figures are at this stage of dryness, it's really easy to add wet material on top or in places. I left this figure without feet and hands. And so now I can come in with wet material against the structure of the dry and just blend it in and build on it. So there's no issue like there is with water-based clay about the timing of adding wet to dryer. There's no shrinkage, which is something we actually love about clay, is the movement. But there's so many problems we have to solve about building with clay because of the shrinkage and the movement. We don't have that here. So that's really, really kind of fun and exciting. So for instance, now that I have all this dry, hard structure, I can add more weight from wet cornstarch clay and keep building up. So I'm just really making kind of a coil, if you will, out of it. And now I'm going to just really, I want to kind of make sure through compression that as I'm adding to the top rim to build up, that it's nice and compressed. It should, the water in the wet material should, you know, when it's all is said and done and it dries, it should be pretty strong in this connection where I added it to the dryer. Everything that I've done with this before has not had an issue, but I just want to make sure I'm spending time there. And of course, as I add to wetter, it's less of an issue because it's more easily blended. Okay, so I can really keep building with these moments of drying, my heat gun blow dryer, or just the air drying overnight, and then come back on the dryer material and just I'll have the structure to keep making more ambitiously formed, complicated forms or bigger scale forms. The surface treatments, again, you know, materials that you're putting into the plastic material, like the dryer lint. You remember in the other video I talked about also creatively envisioning that material that is always there, that has to go into the landfill, as kind of a material that could become a structure for the salt dough when it's really, really wet. So this top piece that's gray was made from dryer lint in wet salt dough. Now it's quite hard and dry. It gave it immediately a different kind of tensile strength because of all the fiber that was added. It wasn't strong like water-based clay is strong when we're building, and it wasn't as plastic, but it had a kind of strength that the regular salt dough did not have. So it also, you know, of course, is left to provide an effective color. So it reminds me to say that you can be putting color into the water that you're using to mix these alternate clays, and you will have colored material. It could be food coloring, of course. Some of your spices that are really staining from the spice cabinet could be used to make a kind of a different colored material. I have left my materials without color so that I can now sort of stain them and work as a painter works on the surface of the sculpture. I also have been collecting these sample jars of latex color for the wall, you know, house paints. You know, I do my swatch. I decide I don't want to use this in my bathroom, and then I instantly have this little tub of color that's going into the garbage? No. So I've been waiting for a project where I could use some of these. So what's nice about these is you know, it's water-based. I can make them very coating and thick. I can use water to make them very, very thin and staining and reveal some of the natural color of the building material underneath. So they're really nice to work with, but you'll come up with many, many different things from the art supply store or from your kitchen that can be materials for drawing and painting on your figurative work with these alternate clays. Because of the hardness of them when they're dry, they're also really good for soft pencils to make those kinds of marks and imagery. Also charcoal. So if you have those kinds of materials around, you'll be able to use them very, very easily here. So that's good. So anyway, that's really all I have for today. I just wanted to check back in. I'm really interested become really interested in the materiality of these clays that we've made, because we've been robbed this semester of finishing in the ceramic studio, but now I really kind of think they're something I'll pursue in a separate body of work. So I'm very excited to to be working alongside of you and discovering these for myself. So thanks very much for this. I'll be back with more later, and thanks for coming by. Bye-bye.